My family spent Thanksgiving dinner laughing at my dead-end tech support job, completely unaware that the $7.2 billion corporate empire I built was secretly finalizing a hostile takeover of their failing manufacturing firm. They thought I was a failure, but by Monday morning, I was going to be their supreme boss, and I was going to fire every single one of them for fraud. Original post. I am Julian Hayes. I am 34 years old. For 15 grueling, heartbreaking years, my own family threw me out into the cold like discarded garbage, absolutely convinced that I would spend my entire existence as a complete and utter failure. While I was sitting at our Thanksgiving table, actively trying to swallow my pride and maintain a tiny shred of family peace, my father looked me dead in the eye across the turkey and sneered that I couldn't even afford a mobile home. He laughed at my expense in front of 12 extended family members. My own mother, Beatrice, silently passed the gravy without saying a single word in my defense. And my golden child brother, Marcus, smirked into his expensive wine glass. But there was one massive, world-shattering thing they did not know. The dead-end IT job they loved to mock every single holiday was actually a $7.2 billion corporate cloud infrastructure empire that I built from the ground up with my own two hands. And right at that very moment, my team of ruthless corporate lawyers was finalizing the hostile takeover of my father's failing company. The dining room inside my parents' sprawling Newton colonial home always smelled of overcooked turkey, stale potpourri, and a thick, suffocating layer of expensive regret. My mother had never really learned how to roast a bird properly. She did this specifically because my father, Richard, insisted he liked his meat well done. It was just another small, pathetic way he controlled the environment around him, and another way she bent over backward to accommodate his every whim, completely disregarding anyone else's preferences. I sat near the end of the long mahogany table, tracing the gold leaf rim of my water glass. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a carving knife. I was 34 years old, but sitting in that chair, surrounded by the judging eyes of my aunts, uncles, and cousins, I felt the familiar phantom weight of my childhood pressing down on my chest. My father was holding court at the head of the table. At 59 years old, he still wore his title of Vice President of Operations at Sterling Industries like a cheap, tarnished crown. He had poured his second glass of bourbon, the alcohol loosening his tongue and sharpening his natural cruelty. He gestured sharply with his silver fork, pointing the prongs directly at me. 34 years old? Richard announced, his voice booming over the quiet clinking of silverware. 34, and still renting some tiny, depressing apartment in Boston. Doing what, exactly, Julian? Playing with computers all day? The room went dead silent. The low murmur of family gossip instantly evaporated. My Aunt Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clutching her linen napkin. Nobody defended me. In 34 years, nobody in this room had ever raised their voice to defend me. My older brother Marcus, who at 36 still lived entirely for our father's validation, puffed out his chest. Marcus had just closed some mid-level supply contract at Sterling, supposedly saving the company a fraction of the money they were hemorrhaging, and he was currently soaking up the praise like a sponge. Beside him, his wife, Vanessa, adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet and offered me a look of practiced, hollow pity. Vanessa came from a family that valued status above oxygen, and she had always viewed me as a humiliating stain on the Hayes family name. Marcus has actual security, my father declared loudly, cutting a dry piece of turkey with excessive force. Marcus has a solid salary, a comprehensive pension plan, and a growing real estate portfolio. Sterling Industries has been the absolute backbone of this sector for 60 years. That is what real business looks like, not whatever fantasy tech bubble you are wasting your youth on. I told you a decade ago to study accounting. I told you to get a safe, practical job. But, no, you had to chase this computer nonsense. Look at you now. You cannot even afford a mobile home right now, Julian. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I felt the cold liquid slide down my throat. I set the glass down perfectly on the exact center of the coaster. My phone, hidden in the inner breast pocket of my tailored Tom Ford blazer, vibrated against my chest. One long pulse, too short. That was the specific notification pattern for Maya, my chief operating officer. The message was undoubtedly urgent, but I absolutely refused to break eye contact with my father. Technology changes extremely fast, I replied. My voice was completely flat, a smooth, unreadable surface devoid of the anger and humiliation he was so desperately trying to provoke. Nothing is ever truly stable in my field. Exactly. My father pounced, his face flushing with the triumphant thrill of a man who thought he had just won the argument. He slammed his hand down on the table, rattling the fine china. You work for some no-name startup that could completely vanish tomorrow morning. You have zero assets. You have no real career. Look at your brother. Look at the incredible life he is building. It is a tragedy, frankly. I smiled. It was not a defensive smile, and it was certainly not a submissive one. It was a genuine, terrifyingly calm smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. For 15 long years, I had let them believe their own fabricated narrative. I let them think I was a struggling, bottom-tier IT desk worker who barely made enough money to cover his monthly rent. I let them assume the absolute worst about me every single time I dodged their invasive questions. It was significantly easier to let them live in their delusion than to explain the complex truth to people who were firmly committed to misunderstanding me. My phone vibrated again. This time, the pulsing was continuous. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the device, and glanced at the screen under the edge of the table. Maya's message was brief, clinical, and completely devastating. The board has unanimously approved the final terms. The acquisition of Sterling Industries closes on Saturday. The global press release goes out Monday morning at market open. Congratulations, boss. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. I placed my hands on the table and slowly stood up. I smoothed the lapels of my dark charcoal suit. It was a custom piece, a fabric so fine and expensive that my father probably assumed I had bought it off the rack at some discount department store. "Would you excuse me?" I said quietly, addressing the silent room. "I have a rather urgent work emergency to handle." My father scoffed loudly, throwing his hands up in the air in an exaggerated display of disgust. "See? You cannot even enjoy a simple family holiday meal without your little tech support desk calling you in to fix a broken printer. What a pathetic, stressful way to live your life." I looked at him. I really looked at him, absorbing the sheer blinding arrogance of a man standing proudly on the deck of a sinking ship, mocking the captain of the rescue vessel that was about to either save him or run him over. "You are absolutely right, Richard," I said softly. "It is no way to live at all." I turned and walked out of the dining room. As I moved down the hallway, I heard Marcus mutter loudly about me probably getting fired by the end of the week, followed immediately by my Aunt Patricia's sharp, mocking bark of laughter. I walked out the heavy oak front door and stepped into the crisp, biting November air. I had parked my battered 2014 Toyota Corolla directly in their driveway specifically for this exact occasion. I kept that old car registered, maintained, and insured for the sole purpose of driving it to these toxic family functions. It perfectly fed their illusion of my failure. I started the sputtering engine, backed out of the driveway, and drove exactly 3 blocks away through the manicured suburban streets. I pulled into a dark, quiet cul-de-sac and parked the Corolla under a flickering streetlight. I stepped out into the freezing drizzle, walked over to the sleek, obsidian black Aston Martin Rapide waiting silently by the curb, and slipped into the pristine driver's seat. The rich leather interior smelled like wealth, power, and untouchable success. I gripped the hand-stitched steering wheel, looking back through the rearview mirror toward the direction of my parents' house. They thought I was a monumental failure. They genuinely believed they held all the power, all the prestige, and all the moral high ground. But they had absolutely no idea what massive, unstoppable force was currently hurtling toward them in the dark. Just 72 hours left until their entire reality shattered. Update 1. To truly understand the absolute ice running through my veins that night in the Aston Martin, you have to understand the searing fire I was forced to walk through to get there. I was not born a cold, calculating businessman. I was systematically forged into one by the very people who were biologically obligated to protect, nurture, and love me. I remember my 16th birthday with perfect, agonizing clarity. It is a memory permanently burned into my psyche. I had spent 6 grueling months drafting, revising, and perfecting an application for a highly prestigious, fiercely competitive technology scholarship program at MIT. It was my only ticket out of that house. I brought the thick, cream-colored acceptance letter to the dinner table that night, my hands shaking uncontrollably with a mixture of immense pride and terrified, desperate hope. I carefully placed the letter right in front of my father's dinner plate. He didn't even bother to read the whole page. He scanned the header, saw the words computer science and financial aid, and his face instantly hardened into a mask of pure disgust. He picked up the letter with 2 fingers, as if it were coated in disease, and deliberately ripped it straight down the middle. Then, he put the pieces together and ripped it again. He tossed the shredded remnants of my future directly onto my plate, right over my birthday dinner. "This is absolute garbage," he had said. His voice wasn't loud or angry. It was worse. It was entirely dismissive. "You are a foolish dreamer, Julian, and dreamers end up broke and begging on the street. You are simply not smart enough for a real STEM field. You do not have the analytical brain for it. You need to focus on something practical like basic administration. Besides, all the money in the college fund is going entirely to Marcus anyway. Marcus has the actual mind for business. He is going to be a leader. You are just going to completely embarrass this family if you try to punch above your weight class." I didn't cry. I looked across the kitchen island at my mother, Beatrice. She was standing by the marble counter, methodically wiping down a spotless surface with a damp rag. She saw the whole thing happen. She saw my heart break into 1,000 jagged pieces on the floor. She saw my father systematically destroy my confidence. She simply averted her eyes, walked over to the table, and whispered in my ear that I should just listen to my father, apologize for being presumptuous, and keep the peace in the house. That was the exact moment I realized I didn't have parents. I had a cruel warden, and I had a cowardly bystander who preferred my silent suffering over causing a minor inconvenience to her husband. 2 years later, on the morning of my 18th birthday, I packed a single frayed canvas duffel bag. I had exactly $60 shoved in my pocket and a full ride scholarship to a different university that I had secured entirely in secret, completely bypassing my father's permission or financial control. As I walked out the front door, my Aunt Patricia happened to be visiting for morning coffee. She stood on the porch, pressed a crumpled $50 bill into my hand with a look of absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Take this, you ungrateful boy," she sneered. "You will be crawling back here in tears within a month when the real world chews you up and spits you out. Do not expect us to roll out the red carpet when you fail." I dropped her $50 bill onto the welcome mat, stepped right over it, and kept walking down the driveway without looking back once. I never crawled back. I never asked them for a single dime. I actually dropped out of college during my sophomore year, not because I was failing my classes, but because my technological concepts were moving significantly faster than the outdated university curriculum. I moved into a freezing, uninsulated garage in Cambridge. I ate cheap instant noodles for 8 months straight. I built the very first rudimentary iteration of NovaCloud Systems on salvaged servers that I practically duct taped together to keep running. 15 years of relentless, brutal, soul-crushing grinding followed. I sacrificed my sleep, my physical health, my personal relationships, and any semblance of a normal, carefree 20s. I worked 100-hour weeks while my peers were at bars, but my obsession paid off. NovaCloud rapidly evolved from a scrappy startup into a global enterprise cloud infrastructure giant. We went public. The IPO was historic. My personal net worth skyrocketed into the billions before I turned 30. I own prime commercial real estate in 3 different states. My diversified stock portfolio generated more passive daily income than my father earned in an entire decade at Sterling. And through it all, I maintained a strict, impenetrable boundary with my family. I only showed up to major holidays to quietly observe them, like a scientist watching a particularly toxic ant farm. Whenever my mother called me, which was rare, it was strictly to boast endlessly about Marcus's mediocre, unearned promotions, or to complain bitterly about petty neighborhood HOA meetings. They never asked about my life, my health, or my career, so I never offered them the truth. The ultimate turning point, the moment the universe aligned perfectly, happened exactly 3 weeks before that fateful Thanksgiving dinner. I was sitting at the massive oak desk in my penthouse office in downtown Boston. Maya, my brilliant COO and the closest thing I had to actual family, walked through the heavy glass doors and dropped a thick red-tabbed financial dossier right in front of me. NovaCloud was currently looking to aggressively diversify our hardware production capabilities by acquiring a legacy manufacturing firm. "Take a very close look at target number 4, Maya said. Her tone was carefully neutral, professional as always, but I saw the sharp, knowing glint in her dark eyes. I opened the heavy file. The bold letters across the top page read, Sterling Industries. My father's company. The place where my father and my brother had practically built their entire arrogant identities. I scanned the executive summary. Sterling was bleeding out from a dozen self-inflicted wounds. Their operational costs were staggering. They were losing major long-term automotive contracts left and right due to missed deadlines and poor quality control. They were legally entangled in a nightmare of bad vendor agreements, and their third-quarter financial projections were absolutely catastrophic. I read through the leadership directory attached to the back of the file. Richard Hayes, VP of Operations. Marcus Hayes, Senior Supply Chain Manager. If they do not secure a massive buyout within the next 2 financial quarters, Maya explained, stepping up to the floor-to-ceiling glass window overlooking the sprawling Boston skyline, they are looking at total, irreversible insolvency. Chapter 11 Bankruptcy, complete asset liquidation. Thousands of people will lose their jobs. I stared hard at the stark black numbers on the white paper. The irony in the room was so thick it was almost suffocating. The very men who endlessly preached to me about financial responsibility, who mercilessly mocked my tech career as a childish fantasy, were currently piloting a massive corporate Titanic straight into a financial glacier, and they were entirely too arrogant to even see the ice. I felt a cold, deep, fundamental shift in my chest. This was not about petty revenge, it was about ruthless, objective business. Sterling actually possessed the exact manufacturing infrastructure and warehouse footprint that NovaCloud desperately needed to scale our new proprietary hardware division. The only real problem with Sterling was its bloated, arrogant, grossly incompetent management team. Draft the preliminary acquisition proposal. I told Maya. My voice was steady, betraying none of the absolute hurricane of emotion churning inside me. Offer their board $380 million. Initiate a hostile takeover protocol if they resist, but trust me, they won't. They are entirely too desperate to survive. And Maya, Make absolutely sure that the post-acquisition transition involves a complete, merciless, forensic audit of the entire operations division. Leave no stone unturned. She nodded, a faint predatory smile touching the corners of her lips. Consider it done, Julian. That single conversation was the match that lit the powder keg. I was about to buy the very ground my toxic family walked on. I thought the financial numbers would just tell a sad story of outdated business practices and lazy management. I was incredibly, profoundly wrong. The truth currently hidden deep in their corporate ledgers was far darker, and far more criminal, than I could have ever imagined. The Saturday immediately following Thanksgiving, the weather in Boston was violently unforgiving. The relentless November rain lashed aggressively against the reinforced floor-to-ceiling windows of the NovaCloud executive boardroom on the 50th floor. The room was designed to intimidate, featuring a massive 30-foot polished marble conference table and state-of-the-art holographic display screens. I sat at the absolute head of the table, wearing a dark navy suit that cost more than most people's annual rent. To my immediate right was Maya, her tablet glowing softly in the dim atmospheric lighting. To my left sat David, my ruthless head of legal, a man whose contract clauses were tighter than a steel trap and who lived for the thrill of corporate litigation. Sitting directly across the vast expanse of marble from us was Arthur Sterling, the aging CEO of Sterling Industries. He looked utterly exhausted, defeated by months of sleepless nights. His suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame, and he sweated visibly despite the aggressively climate-controlled air of my building. He had brought his chief financial officer, a deeply nervous, balding man who couldn't stop bouncing his knee against the underside of the table. They had absolutely no idea who I was in relation to their loudmouth VP of operations. To Arthur and his CFO, I was just Julian Hayes, the terrifyingly young, notoriously ruthless tech billionaire who was aggressively throwing them a heavily conditional life preserver in the middle of a Category 5 financial hurricane. Mr. Hayes. Arthur began, nervously shuffling a stack of printed papers in front of him. His voice trembled slightly, lacking the authority a CEO should project. We deeply appreciate you meeting with us on a holiday weekend. We truly believe Sterling has immense untapped value. Our institutional knowledge and historical footprint in the manufacturing sector are unparalleled. I leaned forward slowly, resting my elbows on the cold marble and clasping my hands together. I let the silence stretch out, forcing Arthur to sit in his own discomfort. Arthur, let us entirely skip the exhausted corporate theater, I said, my voice dangerously soft. Your institutional knowledge is currently driving your company straight into the ground at terminal velocity. Your operational overhead is 45% higher than the industry standard. 2 of your largest legacy automotive clients just walked away last month because of severe supply chain failures. You are sitting at my table today because you have absolutely zero other options left. Arthur swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked desperately at his CFO, who simply stared blankly at the marble table, refusing to make eye contact. We are fully prepared to accept the $380 million valuation exactly as proposed, Arthur said quietly, the fight completely draining out of him. But my board needs specific stipulations regarding current upper management. We desperately want guarantees that the core executive team will remain completely intact for at least a 2-year transition period. We need stability. I slowly turned my head and glanced at David. David didn't say a word. He simply opened his laptop and, with a single keystroke, projected a massive, highly detailed forensic spreadsheet onto the 80-inch display screen directly behind me. It was a comprehensive breakdown of Sterling's catastrophic supply chain losses over the past 18 months. I am afraid that keeping your management team intact is entirely out of the question, I said smoothly, gesturing to the screen behind me. During our due diligence phase, we conducted a deep forensic dive into your operations division. The inefficiencies we uncovered are not just systemic or lazy. They are actively, provably criminal. Arthur paled, his skin turning the color of old parchment. What exactly do you mean? I tapped the table with my index finger, directing his terrified attention to a specific bright red highlighted column on the massive screen. 8 months ago, your company abruptly switched its primary raw material supplier for your Ohio plant to a brand new vendor called Zenith Logistics. That specific contract cost your company 25% more than your previous, highly reliable vendor. Furthermore, the material quality from Zenith was so remarkably poor that it resulted in a massive, multi-million-dollar product recall. Why on earth was that vendor approved? Arthur wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. The contract was thoroughly vetted and handled by our operations VP and his senior supply chain manager. They vehemently assured the board it was a necessary and strategic pivot due to international tariff changes. I looked right through him, my eyes stripping away his remaining dignity. I pulled out a separate, thick red legal folder that David had painstakingly prepared. I opened it and slid 3 glossy photographs and a bank statement across the table toward Arthur. The senior manager who aggressively pushed that catastrophic contract is Marcus Hayes, I stated, my voice echoing in the large room. The vice president who officially approved it, bypassing standard compliance checks, is Richard Hayes. Our private investigators dug into the corporate filings. Zenith Logistics is not a legitimate manufacturing supplier. It is a shell company registered in Delaware, fully owned by Marcus Hayes' father-in-law. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, ringing in my ears. Arthur looked like he had just been struck forcefully in the chest with a sledgehammer. The nervous CFO completely stopped bouncing his knee. Marcus Hayes essentially funneled millions of dollars of corporate funds directly into his wife's family business at a massive premium, I continued, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that demanded absolute attention. And Richard Hayes deliberately buried the internal audit reports to protect his incompetent son. This is not just a series of bad business decisions, Arthur. This is a massive, coordinated breach of fiduciary duty. This is blatant fraud. This is grounds for an immediate, company-destroying lawsuit. If this information goes public, your stock goes to absolute zero before the market even opens on Monday morning. Your investors will demand blood. Arthur buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a ragged breath. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and completely defeated. He knew he was trapped in a corner with a predator. What are your exact terms? NovaCloud assumes total, unconditional corporate control, David stated sharply, finally speaking up as he slid the final binding contract across the table. No golden parachutes for your operations management. No severance packages for executives terminated for cause. We retain the unilateral right to terminate any employee immediately if gross misconduct is proven. You sign this document right now, today, or we walk away from this table, leak the fraud investigation to the press, and let the SEC tear your entire company apart piece by piece. There was a long, agonizing moment of hesitation. A senior board member on our side, Gregory, cleared his throat loudly over the conference speakerphone. Gregory was an old-school, highly conservative investor who always actively looked for a reason to doubt my aggressive, modern tactics. Julian, Gregory said, his voice dripping with condescension, are we absolutely sure we want to inherit this radioactive mess? The legal liability alone is significant. The potential for a massive lawsuit from angry shareholders is high. I shut Gregory down instantly, my voice cracking like a whip. We are buying the physical infrastructure and the patents, Gregory, not the toxic personnel. The legal liability vanishes the second I clean house and turn their operations over to the authorities. The core assets are perfectly sound. The cancer is entirely localized in middle management, and I am the surgeon holding the scalpel. Arthur slowly picked up the heavy, silver Mont Blanc pen provided by David. His hand shook violently as he signed his name on the dotted line. His signature was jagged and uneven. With a few frantic strokes of expensive ink, 60 years of Sterling Industries history, and the entire professional foundation of my family, was officially handed over to me. After Arthur and his silent CFO left the room, looking like men walking to a funeral, Maya began efficiently packing up her tablet. That was incredibly brutal, she noted softly, though looking closely at her face, she didn't look the least bit displeased. It was necessary, I replied, standing up slowly and walking over to the massive window. I looked out over the gray, rain-soaked city below. I had just successfully purchased the very entity that gave my cruel father his entire inflated sense of superiority. I literally owned the oak desk he sat at. I owned the company checks he deposited every 2 weeks. I owned the entire corporate ladder he had spent 30 years ruthlessly climbing. Prepare the immediate termination protocols, I told David, not turning away from the glass. I want Vincent and the elite HR restructuring team waiting in the lobby of Sterling's Worcester facility first thing Wednesday morning. Nobody gets a pass. Nobody gets a warning. I walked out of the boardroom feeling a strange, intoxicating mix of pure adrenaline and profound, chilling clarity. The dark storm was no longer just gathering on the horizon. It was here, and it was about to wash away 15 years of toxic lies, manipulation, and abuse. Update 2. Sunday night, the massive penthouse was completely, hauntingly silent. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain beating against the reinforced glass of my living room windows. I walked over to the custom wet bar, poured myself a generous glass of Macallan 25, and watched the amber liquid catch the low, moody light of the room. I sat down at my expansive kitchen island, cracked my knuckles, and opened my laptop because the ink on the contract was dry. I now had total, unrestricted administrative access to Sterling's internal corporate servers. I bypassed their outdated firewall with ease and pulled up the highly confidential HR files for the operations division. I desperately wanted to see the exact mechanism of my father's delusion in black and white. I wanted to see the paper trail of the lies they told themselves. Richard Hayes' personnel file was exactly what I expected, yet somehow still deeply pathetic. 31 years of continuous employment. He started as a lowly floor supervisor and bullied, intimidated, and manipulated his way up the ranks. His official performance reviews over the last 10 years were shockingly mediocre. Meets basic expectations. Actively resists modern software integration. relies entirely on outdated, inefficient metrics. He had not received a single merit-based salary promotion or significant bonus in 4 years. He was a corporate dinosaur waiting blindly for the meteor, completely unaware that the sky was actively falling around him. Then I clicked over and opened Marcus's file. It was a staggering masterpiece of blatant nepotism. Marcus had been promoted 3 separate times in just 6 years, despite a massive, undeniable trail of written warnings from project managers regarding his consistently missed deadlines, aggressive behavior toward female subordinates, and general incompetence. Digging deeper into the archived documents, I found a scanned, handwritten note from Helen, my father's loyal executive secretary of 20 years. Helen had bravely filed a formal HR complaint about Marcus 2 years ago, risking her own job to speak up. Marcus Hayes consistently creates a highly toxic and hostile work environment, Helen had written in precise, careful handwriting. He routinely offloads his massive administrative errors onto junior staff members, refuses to take accountability, and explicitly leverages his blood relationship with the vice president of operations to avoid any disciplinary action. If this behavior continues, I deeply fear for the long-term stability and morale of this department. My father had personally intercepted and overridden Helen's complaint before it reached corporate HR. He had stamped it as a minor, resolved interpersonal conflict and buried it in a subfolder. He actively protected the golden child at the extreme expense of the company, the hardworking employees, and ultimately his own legacy. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive whiskey. The deep burn in my chest felt good, felt grounding. I thought about Marcus bragging loudly at the Thanksgiving table about his real estate investments, his secure pension, and his brilliant business acumen. I thought about my mother nodding along, perfectly content in her suffocating bubble of denial, choosing the comfort of a lie over the difficult reality of the truth. They had built an entire elaborate reality based solely on my father's supposed brilliance and authority. Tomorrow morning, that fragile, pathetic reality was going to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The impending divorce of Marcus and his status-obsessed wife Vanessa was practically guaranteed once the money dried up. A bitter custody battle over their assets would likely follow. It was going to be a metaphorical funeral for the Hayes family ego. I didn't sleep a single wink that night. I sat alone in the dark, watching the bright lights of the ferries crossing the dark waters of the harbor. I searched my soul, looking for a shred of guilt or hesitation. I found absolutely nothing. I felt no guilt. I felt no remorse. I had spent my entire youth trying desperately to figure out how to earn their basic love, only to brutally realize that their love was entirely conditional upon my total submission. They desperately needed me to be a small, pathetic failure so they could feel big and successful. I refused to be small anymore. I was a giant, and it was time they looked up. Monday morning arrived crisp, cold, and blindingly bright. I showered, shaved with meticulous care, and dressed in a fresh charcoal gray Tom Ford suit. I locked my heavy platinum Rolex into place on my wrist, grabbed my keys, and drove the Aston Martin through the light morning traffic to the NovaCloud Tower. The energy on the executive floor was absolutely electric. It hummed with the focused intensity of a war room. My elite PR team was stationed in the main bullpens, their keyboards clacking relentlessly as they coordinated with major news outlets. Maya was pacing near the glass walls, a Bluetooth earpiece in her ear, barking rapid-fire orders to the legal team, at exactly 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time, perfectly synchronized with the opening bell on the New York Stock Exchange. The global press release went live across every major financial newswire in the world. NovaCloud Systems announces aggressive $380 million acquisition of legacy manufacturer Sterling Industries. Within 10 minutes, the news exploded. My face, sharp and unsmiling in my official corporate headshot, was plastered across the front page of Bloomberg, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal. The massive feature articles detailed my incredibly aggressive business strategy, my rapid rise from a struggling college dropout to a billionaire titan, and the ruthless, clinical efficiency with which NovaCloud absorbed its corporate targets. There was absolutely no escaping the news. It was broadcast live on CNBC's morning show. It was trending #1 on LinkedIn and Twitter. I walked into my private office, closed the heavy glass door, and sat down at my massive desk. My hands were folded perfectly on the dark leather blotter. I stared intensely at the sleek black phone sitting next to my computer monitor. I knew exactly what was happening 30 miles away in the quiet, manicured suburbs of Newton. I pictured my father walking into his pristine kitchen, adjusting his expensive silk tie, pouring his black coffee into his favorite mug. I pictured him picking up his iPad to check the morning market reports, the way he always did to make himself look important in front of my mother. I pictured his aging eyes scanning the bold headlines. I knew the exact sequence of his reactions. The mild confusion settling in first, the squinting at the screen, assuming it was a typo. The sudden, horrifying, breathtaking realization as he looked at the high-resolution photo of his deeply estranged, supposedly failed son staring back at him under the banner of a multi-billion-dollar corporate buyout. The terrifying realization that his son was now his supreme boss. At exactly 7:14 a.m., the phone on my desk finally began to ring. The shrill sound cut through the silence of my office like a siren. I calmly looked down at the glowing caller ID screen. It was a Newton area code. It was my father's personal cell phone number. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring once. I let it ring twice, 3 times. I let the absolute suffocating panic build on the other end of the line. I let him sweat. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, I reached out and picked up the heavy receiver. "Julian Hayes speaking," I said. My voice was a perfectly calibrated mask of absolute corporate indifference. I sounded like a man who was about to order a morning coffee, not a man who had just violently upended his family's entire financial existence. "Julian." My father's voice cracked instantly the second he heard me speak. It was breathless, tight, and completely stripped of the booming, aggressively authoritative tone he always utilized to completely dominate the Thanksgiving dinner table. "Julian, what the hell is going on? What is this absolute garbage playing on the news this morning? They are running a massive continuous story on CNBC right now. They are openly stating that your company, this NovaCloud thing, just bought Sterling. They are putting your professional picture right there on the screen and calling you the chief executive officer." "Yes, Richard," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair and looking out at the sprawling, sun-drenched Boston skyline. NovaCloud Systems officially acquired Sterling Industries for a total valuation of $380 million. The final legally binding paperwork was signed by Arthur Sterling on Saturday afternoon right here in my boardroom. We initiated the global press release at market open this morning. There was a long, incredibly heavy silence on the line. I could literally hear his rapid, shallow breathing. I pictured him standing alone in his pristine granite countertop kitchen. His expensive silk ties suddenly feeling like a tightening noose around his thick neck. I pictured the morning coffee going completely cold in his favorite mug. "This is a massive mistake," he stammered, the deep-seated denial kicking in incredibly hard. He was desperately trying to fit this massive new piece of information into his tiny, narrow worldview. "This has to be some kind of incredibly sick joke or a media error. You do not have that kind of money. You are just a tech support worker. You rent a tiny apartment. You drive a beaten-up Toyota Corolla. You cannot possibly afford to buy my entire company. You do not have the financial leverage. I own the massive corporate building you are standing in right now, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous register that left absolutely no room for debate. "I literally own the exact wooden desk you sit at every single day. I own the corporate ladder you spent 30 years of your life desperately and ruthlessly climbing. I dictate your salary. I control your benefits package. You thought I was a monumental failure because you actively, desperately needed me to be one. You needed a convenient punching bag to make yourself feel infinitely superior. But while you were busy mocking my career choices and trying to make me feel small, I was busy building an unstoppable empire. And this morning, my empire just swallowed your entire world whole." He made a sharp, choking sound, a pathetic gasp for air like a man who had just been forcefully punched in the stomach. "I am your father," he managed to say, his voice trembling so violently I could barely understand the words. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot buy the company I work for. I am not doing a single thing to you as your son," I corrected him coldly, maintaining strict professional boundaries. "I am operating entirely as the chief executive officer of the parent conglomerate that now completely owns your employer. We are sending an elite HR restructuring team to the Worcester facility today at noon. I strongly suggest you put on your absolute best suit, gather your incredibly outdated performance metrics, and prepare for a very long, very difficult afternoon. We will be aggressively evaluating every single salary, every unearned promotion, and every operational failure under your direct management over the last decade. Have a highly productive day, Richard." I placed the receiver down gently, completely cutting off whatever desperate emotional plea he was about to make. The resulting silence in my office felt incredibly pure and clean. By exactly noon that day, my aggressive integration team, led by a ruthless, highly efficient corporate hatchet man named Vincent, descended upon the Sterling manufacturing plant in Worcester. I didn't go in person. I didn't need to be physically present to exert my total control, because I was the new owner. I had full unrestricted access to the high-definition security cameras installed in their main conference room. I sat back comfortably at my desk in Boston, pulled up the live, high-resolution video feed on my massive secondary monitor, and watched the corporate destruction unfold in real time. The large conference room was packed wall-to-wall with terrified middle managers and senior executives. My father sat right near the front row, his posture rigid, his face an ashen, sickly gray. Right next to him was Marcus, my golden child brother, looking exactly like a deer caught directly in the headlights of a massive, speeding freight train. Vincent stood confidently at the head of the long table, projecting our forensic financial findings onto the massive screen. Vincent didn't mince a single word. He systematically and brutally tore apart Sterling's catastrophic operational inefficiencies. He explicitly pointed out the staggering financial waste, the deeply outdated supply chain metrics, and the gross, undeniable incompetence of the upper management team. When Vincent calmly announced to the room that NovaCloud was officially initiating a 45% workforce reduction in the operations sector, effective immediately, I watched my father visibly flinch on camera. The high-definition feed caught the exact, precise moment his entire inflated, artificial ego completely collapsed. He looked around the crowded room, making terrified eye contact with the various men and women he had bullied, intimidated, and belittled for years. In that singular moment, he realized that he no longer held a single ounce of power or authority over any of them. He was no longer the intimidating vice president. He was just another highly expendable line item on my massive financial spreadsheet. At exactly 3 p.m, my private, secure office line rang. It was the head of building security stationed down in the grand lobby. "Mr. Hayes," the security chief said, his tone incredibly respectful and cautious. "We have an older gentleman down here actively demanding to see you. He claims to be your biological father. He does not have a scheduled appointment. He refuses to leave, and he is becoming highly agitated and loud with the front desk staff. Do you want me to have the security team physically escort him off the premises?" "Send him up," I said smoothly. "Ensure he does not wander the floor. Bring him directly to my suite." I stood up, walked over to my custom, marble-topped wet bar, and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. I wanted an incredibly clear, focused head for this interaction. 5 minutes later, the heavy soundproof glass doors of my executive suite slid open silently. My father stepped awkwardly into the room. He stopped dead in his tracks the moment he crossed the threshold. His eyes darted wildly around the massive, luxurious space, taking in the breathtaking panoramic views of the Boston skyline, the incredibly expensive modern art hanging on the walls, and the sheer undeniable scale of the immense wealth I had accumulated. Standing in my world, he looked incredibly small and insignificant. His tailored navy suit, the one he always wore to look intimidating at family dinners, suddenly looked cheap and poorly fitted. His shoulders were deeply slumped, and the arrogant, overbearing swagger he always carried himself with was completely, permanently gone. "Julian," he began, his voice shaking terribly. He took a slow, hesitant step forward, treating the plush carpet of my office like it was a deadly minefield. "Have a seat, Richard," I said, gesturing casually to the sleek imported leather guest chair positioned directly opposite my massive desk. I didn't offer him a drink. I didn't offer him a warm familial greeting. I didn't even stand up to shake his hand. I sat back down at my desk, folded my hands together, and waited. He practically collapsed into the heavy leather chair. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the very first time in my entire 34 years of life. He didn't see the awkward, desperate, terrified teenager he had so casually emotionally abused. He saw a billionaire titan. He saw a man who held his entire financial future, his precious pension, and his public reputation firmly in the palm of his hand. I don't understand any of this," he whispered. His eyes were wide with a mixture of raw fear and profound, undeniable confusion. "How did you possibly do this? Where did you get this kind of leverage? Why did you deliberately hide this from us for all these years? We are your family, Julian. We would have celebrated this incredible success with you. You would have aggressively exploited this," I corrected him sharply, slicing straight through his pathetic, revisionist attempt at rewriting our incredibly toxic history. "You would have weaponized my financial success to elevate your own pathetic social status at your incredibly pretentious country club. You spent my entire childhood telling me I was a worthless dreamer. You literally ripped my college scholarship application into tiny pieces right in front of my face because my ambition deeply threatened your fragile, inadequate ego. You aggressively mocked my career at Thanksgiving dinner just 3 days ago. You proudly told the entire extended family that I could not even afford a mobile home. You built your entire identity on the false, comforting premise that you were fundamentally superior to me. I was just trying to toughen you up for the real world," he pleaded, gripping the edge of my desk with white knuckles. "The corporate world is an incredibly hard, unforgiving place, Julian. I wanted you to be practical and grounded. I was just being a strong father. You were being a weak bully," I said flatly, my voice echoing slightly in the large room. "And your constant, relentless bullying absolutely made me ruthless. But we are not sitting here today to discuss your catastrophic, monumental failures as a parent. We are here to discuss your catastrophic, monumental failures as a vice president of operations." I slowly opened the thick, red-tabbed legal file sitting prominently on my desk. I saw his anxious eyes track the movement of the paper, his anxiety spiking instantly. He inherently knew his performance metrics were terrible, but he still foolishly thought he could fast-talk his way out of it like he always did. He still desperately thought his prestigious title and his tenure protected him from actual consequences. He had absolutely no idea about the massive, career-ending legal bomb I was about to drop directly onto his lap. I opened the heavy red folder and slowly, deliberately spread the highly confidential documents out across the smooth leather surface of my desk. I arranged them meticulously, making absolutely sure the bright yellow highlighted financial discrepancies and the damning signatures were perfectly visible from his exact angle. I wanted him to see the undeniable proof of his own demise. Your overall department metrics are an absolute, unmitigated disaster, Richard, I stated, my voice completely devoid of any familial warmth or sympathy. You have completely, thoroughly stagnated for over a decade. Your output is terrible, your employee retention is a joke, and your strategic vision is non-existent. But unfortunately for you, poor performance is just a standard corporate firing offense. What you and Marcus have deliberately done over the past 18 months goes incredibly far beyond simple management incompetence. My father swallowed incredibly hard, his throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. Marcus is a good, hard-working boy, he said defensively, a pathetic knee-jerk reaction he had employed for 36 years to shield his golden child from any accountability. He works incredibly hard for that company. The current supply chain issues are a massive global problem, Julian. You simply cannot blame your own brother for international shipping delays and logistics nightmares. I am not blaming Marcus for international shipping delays, I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms heavily on the desk. I am explicitly blaming Marcus for documented, undeniable corporate fraud, and I am explicitly blaming you for aggressively, illegally covering it up to protect him from federal prosecution. The color completely drained from my father's face in an instant. He looked exactly like a man who had just been diagnosed with a highly aggressive terminal illness. What on earth are you talking about, Julian? I picked up the detailed bank statements and the official state shell company registration documents. I read the specific details out loud, ensuring every single word landed like a devastating physical blow to his chest. 8 months ago, Marcus unilaterally and inexplicably canceled a highly reliable, cost-effective raw materials contract. He then immediately signed a massive, multi-million-dollar exclusive vendor agreement with a completely unknown company called Zenith Logistics. Zenith Logistics explicitly charges 25% above the current competitive market rate, and their materials are so severely defective they caused a massive product recall in your Ohio facility. I paused, locking my cold eyes directly with his terrified ones. Zenith Logistics is a registered shell corporation entirely owned and operated by Vanessa's father, your precious daughter-in-law's family. Marcus deliberately, systematically funneled millions of dollars of sterling corporate funds directly into his own family's pockets. He essentially embezzled massive amounts of money through highly inflated, fraudulent vendor contracts. He bought real estate with stolen corporate money. And when Helen, your fiercely loyal executive secretary, correctly flagged the glaring financial discrepancies and bravely filed a formal HR grievance, you personally intercepted that report, physically destroyed the paper copy, and buried the digital trail deep in the servers to keep your golden boy out of federal prison. My father began to physically shake. His hands trembled so violently he had to grip his own knees with staggering force just to keep them relatively still. Julian, please, he begged, his voice dropping to a desperate, broken, raspy whisper, you have to understand the pressure he was under. Vanessa's family was actively threatening to cut them off financially. Marcus was drowning in massive, unmanageable debt. They were going to lose their luxury house. I had to step in and protect my son. I am his father, Julian. I had to protect him from total ruin. You aggressively protected a white-collar criminal at the extreme expense of your own corporate integrity and the livelihoods of hundreds of innocent, hard-working factory workers. I shot back, my voice echoing off the glass walls with righteous fury. That is a massive, unforgivable breach of fiduciary duty. I have a highly aggressive team of corporate lawyers currently drafting the lawsuit as we speak. I have enough irrefutable, documented evidence to have you both arrested, handcuffed, and charged with grand larceny and corporate fraud before the sun even sets today. Before my father could even attempt to formulate another pathetic, enabling excuse, the heavy glass doors of my office swung open violently, crashing against the rubber stops. Marcus burst into the room, his face flushed a bright, angry red, sweating profusely through his expensive dress shirt. I had explicitly instructed my security team downstairs to let him up the absolute moment he arrived in the building. I wanted them both in this room for the final execution. Dad, Marcus yelled, completely ignoring my commanding presence at first. He marched aggressively toward my father, waving his cell phone frantically in the air. HR just handed me a termination notice with cause. They physically escorted me out of the building with armed security. They are explicitly saying that NovaCloud is preparing to file a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit against me for the Zenith Logistics contract. You specifically told me you buried that paperwork. You promised me to my face that absolutely nobody would ever find out about the real estate ties. Marcus, for the love of God, shut your mouth. My father hissed violently, frantically gesturing toward me sitting behind the desk. Marcus finally stopped his hysterical ranting and looked across the room at me. He looked at the custom designer suit, the breathtaking panoramic view of the city, The sheer undeniable power radiating from the chair I occupied. The absolute reality of the situation finally penetrated his thick, arrogant, entitled skull. His jaw literally dropped open. "Julian?" Marcus stammered, looking wildly back and forth between me and our terrified father. "What are you doing sitting behind that desk? What is going on here?" "I own the company, Marcus," I said simply, my voice calm and deadly. "I am the chief executive officer and majority shareholder of NovaCloud Systems. I bought Sterling Industries on Saturday afternoon. And I am the exact person who specifically ordered your immediate, highly public termination." Marcus looked like his brain was completely short-circuiting. The golden child, the arrogant man who had smoothly coasted through his entire existence on unearned privilege, nepotism, and parental favoritism, was suddenly standing completely exposed in front of a corporate firing squad. And he had absolutely no armor left to protect him. Blind, sheer panic overtook him completely. The deeply ingrained instinct for selfish self-preservation kicked in immediately, instantly stripping away any lingering loyalty he had to the man who had spent 36 years fiercely protecting him. Marcus turned sharply toward my father, his face twisting into an incredibly ugly mask of pure unadulterated desperation. "Tell him it was entirely your idea," Marcus screamed at our father, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger right at the older man's chest. "Tell him you forcefully coerced me to sign those vendor contracts. You are the vice president of operations. You have the ultimate authority. I was just blindly following your direct, explicit orders. You told me to push the Zenith deal through to save the family face." My father violently recoiled as if he had just been physically slashed across the face with a razor blade. "Marcus, what on earth are you saying? I committed a felony to save your house. I risked my entire professional career and my pension to cover up your incredible mess. I didn't know what I was doing." Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically, echoing loudly in the large office. He turned back to me, clasping his hands together in a pathetic, disgusting begging gesture. "Julian, listen to me. Please listen to me." He manipulated me. He explicitly threatened to fire me if I didn't sign the Zenith paperwork and secure the funds. He is trying to frame me to save his own skin. "Please, Julian, you have to believe me. I have a massive mortgage. I have 2 luxury car payments. Vanessa will absolutely demand a divorce and take full custody of the kids if I go bankrupt. You have to drop the lawsuit. Punish him. He is the mastermind, not me." I sat back comfortably in my heavy leather chair and watched the magnificent, beautifully tragic spectacle unfold before my eyes. This was the legendary, ultimate twist I had not even fully anticipated when I bought the company, but it was incredibly, profoundly poetic. My father had spent 36 years practically worshipping this boy. He had happily sacrificed my childhood, destroyed my self-esteem, and ultimately immolated his own corporate integrity to build a massive golden pedestal for Marcus. And the absolute second things got difficult, the very second there were actual, terrifying, life-altering consequences, the golden child aggressively shoved his own father directly under the bus without a single moment of hesitation. I looked at Richard. He was staring at Marcus with a look of profound, soul-crushing devastation. The lifelong illusion was completely, permanently shattered. He finally saw his absolute favorite son for exactly what he was. A weak, cowardly, highly manipulative parasite who cared for absolutely no one but himself. My father seemed to age 20 years in 10 agonizing seconds. He slumped back deeply into the guest chair, his eyes hollow, his breathing ragged and shallow. The grand empire he thought he built in his home and at his office was entirely reduced to smoking ash. "Are you quite finished throwing your father to the corporate wolves, Marcus?" I asked, my voice cutting through his hysterical, pathetic rambling like a freshly sharpened knife. Marcus stopped abruptly, panting heavily, looking at me with desperate, pleading, terrified eyes. "Your entire fabricated narrative is completely useless." I told him coldly, tapping the thick file. "I already possess Helen's original handwritten HR complaint that names you explicitly. I have the highly encrypted digital footprints. I have the bank routing numbers tracing the money directly to your father-in-law's real estate holding company. I know exactly who initiated the fraud, and I know exactly who covered it up. The absolute only reason I am not calling the federal authorities right this very second is because the resulting public scandal and criminal trials would temporarily dip my newly acquired stock price, and I absolutely refuse to lose a single dollar of my personal wealth over your staggering, monumental stupidity." I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket, towering over both of the broken men in my office. "Here is exactly what is going to happen next," I announced, delivering the absolute final, unappealable verdict. "Marcus, you are officially terminated effective immediately. You are being fired for gross misconduct, massive financial negligence, and corporate fraud. You will receive absolutely no severance package. You will not receive a glowing letter of recommendation. Your accumulated company stock options are entirely, legally voided due to your explicit breach of contract. Furthermore, you will personally sit down with my lawyer today and sign a binding legal agreement transferring the stolen funds back to Sterling's accounts. Or my legal team will obliterate you in civil court until you cannot even afford a public defender. Now, get out of my office, get out of my building, and never attempt to contact me again." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, perhaps to beg one last time, but the sheer, icy finality in my eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. He looked down at our father one last time, desperately hoping for a miraculous rescue that was never, ever coming. Richard didn't even look at him. Richard just stared blankly at the expensive carpet. Marcus turned around, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably, and walked out the heavy glass door. His entire artificially inflated life, completely ruined by his own insatiable greed. I turned my focused attention back to the thoroughly broken man sitting silently in the guest chair. "Richard," I said softly, the quiet tone far more terrifying than a shout. "You are officially stripped of your prestigious title as Vice President of Operations. You are being aggressively demoted to a part-time advisory role. Your new salary will reflect a brutal 65% pay cut. You will have absolutely zero direct reports, zero hiring authority, zero access to corporate funds, and zero executive privileges. You will sit in a tiny windowless cubicle on the ground floor. You will run basic efficiency reports all day, and you will report directly to Vincent." My father slowly, painfully lifted his head. His eyes were completely bloodshot. "Why are you keeping me on the payroll at all, Julian? Why not just fire me and be done with it? Why drag this out?" "Because simply firing you is entirely too easy," I replied with brutal honesty. "Because I want you to wake up every single morning, drive to that factory, sit in a tiny, depressing cubicle, and remember exactly who owns you. I want you to experience the exact same feeling of total, suffocating powerlessness that you deliberately and systematically inflicted on me for 18 years. You keep your basic health insurance, and you keep a tiny fraction of your dignity so you don't end up on the street, but you lose your entire empire." He nodded slowly, completely defeated. He stood up, his joints popping audibly, looking like a frail elderly man who had given up on life. "You win, Julian," he whispered, his voice incredibly hollow. "You finally proved you are better than us." "I was always better than you, Richard," I said, my voice unwavering. "You were just too incredibly blind and arrogant to see it." He turned and walked out of my office, the heavy glass doors sliding shut securely behind him, sealing his dismal corporate fate forever. Exactly 10 minutes later, my personal cell phone rang, vibrating aggressively against the wood of my desk. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Beatrice. The catastrophic news had obviously reached the Newton house. I picked the phone up, putting it on speakerphone, and tossing it onto the center of my desk. "Julian Hayes, what kind of absolute monster have you become?" my mother shrieked loudly through the speaker. Her voice was shrill, completely abandoning her usual passive-aggressive, victim-playing tone for outright hostility. "Marcus just called me in absolute tears. He says you brutally fired him. He says his wife is already threatening divorce. He says you humiliated your father in front of the entire company. How could you systematically destroy your own family like this? You are a cold-blooded sociopath." I leaned back comfortably in my chair, listening to her aggressively play the ultimate victim one last time. "I am running a highly efficient, legally compliant business, Beatrice," I replied calmly. "Marcus committed blatant corporate fraud. Richard illegally covered it up. They are simply facing the natural legal consequences of their own incredibly stupid, arrogant actions. We are your family," she screamed, her voice breaking. "You owe us your absolute loyalty. We sacrificed everything for you boys. We constantly struggled to provide for you. We barely had 2 pennies to rub together to put food on the table, and this is exactly how you repay us." That was the exact perfect moment I decided to detonate the final explosive charge. I had carefully saved this specific piece of information for over a decade, waiting patiently for the absolute perfect moment to completely expose her deeply ingrained hypocrisy. "Let us talk intimately about your monumental sacrifices, Beatrice," I said, my voice turning to absolute, unforgiving ice. "Let us talk specifically about how you constantly, relentlessly told me we were completely broke when I was in high school. Do you remember when I practically begged you on my knees for $60 to pay the application fee for that advanced coding camp? Do you remember looking me directly in the eye, sighing heavily, and telling me the bank account was completely empty, and that I needed to stop being so incredibly selfish?" There was a slight, terrified hesitation on her end. "I do not see what ancient history has to do with this current situation. 3 days after you looked me in the eye and told me we were completely broke," I interrupted her sharply, "I was looking for a stapler in your home office desk. I found a massive bank withdrawal receipt tucked inside your personal ledger. It was a certified cashier's check for $95,000. You secretly took $95,000 out of your hidden inheritance account, an account you actively hid from my father, and you gave it entirely to Marcus for the massive down payment on his luxury house. You stole my college fund to buy him real estate." The silence on the phone was absolutely deafening. I could practically hear her heart completely stop beating. You lied to me for my entire life, I continued, my voice relentless and heavy. You passively watched my father emotionally abuse me. You actively watched him destroy my self-esteem, and you aggressively participated in starving me of resources just so you could secretly fund Marcus's lavish, unearned lifestyle. You are not a victim, Beatrice, you never were. You are the silent, manipulative architect of this entire toxic family dynamic. You actively enabled the monster, and you secretly funded the parasite. Julian, I was just trying to make sure Marcus was properly settled, she stammered, the righteous anger completely evaporating, immediately replaced by the pathetic, broken stuttering of a massive liar caught red-handed. Marcus is definitely settled now, I said coldly. He is currently unemployed, facing massive civil lawsuits, and his impending divorce will absolutely ruin him. The custody battle alone will bankrupt him. And you and Richard are going to have to quickly figure out how to pay taxes on that Newton mansion with a 65% pay cut. Do not ever call this number again. You do not have a son named Julian anymore. I reached forward and ended the call abruptly. I picked up the phone, navigated to her contact, and hit block. I did the exact same thing for my father and my brother. With 3 simple, highly satisfying taps on a glass screen, I completely and permanently severed the rotting, toxic umbilical cord that had been slowly choking the life out of me for 34 years. I breathed in deeply. The air in my office felt incredibly clean, wonderfully light, and absolutely, unconditionally free. 6 months later, the vibrant city of Boston was beautifully bathed in the warm, golden glow of a perfect July evening. I stood on the massive, sprawling wraparound terrace of my penthouse, a heavy crystal glass of incredibly expensive bourbon in my hand. I was watching the brilliant, colorful explosions of the 4th of July fireworks reflecting perfectly off the dark, churning waters of the harbor. The complete transition and total restructuring of Sterling Industries had been a massive, unprecedented corporate success. After surgically and mercilessly cutting out the toxic rot of the upper management team, the company had practically healed itself overnight. We modernized the incredibly outdated factory equipment, streamlined the disastrous supply chain, and most importantly, we significantly raised the wages and secured the 401k retirement plans of the actual, hardworking men and women on the factory floor. The dedicated employees who had suffered in silence for years under my father's arrogant, incompetent regime were finally thriving. NovaCloud's stock price had surged an incredible 28% since the acquisition was finalized. Wall Street called me a relentless visionary, I just called it taking out the trash. Word travels incredibly fast in my extended family, mostly thanks to my Aunt Patricia, who possessed a terrifying, almost supernatural ability to sniff out gossip, drama, and failure and broadcast it loudly to the world. I didn't actively seek out the information about my former family, but it aggressively filtered its way back to me anyway. My father, Richard, had lasted exactly 3 agonizing months in his tiny, humiliating cubicle. The daily, grinding psychological torture of watching his former subordinates completely ignore his existence while he reported to a logistics manager half his age finally broke his massive, fragile ego completely. He officially submitted his letter of resignation in late March. Without his inflated vice president's salary and severely burdened by a massive mountain of hidden credit card debt they had accumulated, trying to maintain their wealthy facade for the neighbors, he and my mother were completely forced to sell the sprawling Newton Colonial. They drastically downsized to a small, incredibly modest 2-bedroom condo in a significantly less prestigious suburb. Their elite country club memberships were unceremoniously revoked due to unpaid dues. Their entire carefully curated social standing evaporated into thin air. Marcus's monumental downfall was even more spectacular and complete. Just as I accurately predicted, the absolute second the corporate money dried up, the lavish lifestyle vanished. Vanessa, realizing her golden goose was entirely cooked and absolutely terrified of the looming financial ruin, aggressively filed for divorce before the ink on Marcus's termination papers was even fully dry. She ruthlessly took the house. She took the luxury cars, and she took primary custody of the kids. Marcus was currently renting a dingy, incredibly depressing apartment over a noisy bowling alley in Worcester, working as a mid-level logistics dispatcher for a local trucking company, earning a tiny fraction of his former salary. My cell phone buzzed softly in my pocket, pulling me out of my peaceful thoughts. I pulled it out and glanced at the glowing screen. It was an incredibly long text message from an unknown number, but I recognized the distinct area code immediately. It was my father. He must have literally gone to the store and bought a new prepaid phone just to bypass the permanent block I had put on his primary number. I opened the message. It was a massive wall of text. Julian, I know you explicitly told us never to contact you again, and I swear to you I will respect your boundaries after this single message. I have had a lot of time to sit in complete silence and think about my life. I have watched everything I built crumble into dust, and I finally realized that I am the exact person who tore it all down. I spent my entire life foolishly measuring a man's worth by his corporate title and his bank account, and I was completely, utterly blind to the incredible brilliance and strength of my own son. You built an empire, Julian, and you did it entirely without me. I was deeply threatened by your potential, so I desperately tried to crush it. I protected Marcus because his dependence made me feel powerful, but I only ended up ruining his life, too. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry for the immense pain I caused you. I do not expect your forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I just needed you to know that I finally see you. I am incredibly proud of the man you became. Dad. I stood there perfectly still on the terrace, the colorful fireworks booming loudly in the night sky above me, and I read the incredibly long message twice. If I had received this exact text message a decade ago, it would have fundamentally, emotionally shattered me. It would have sent me running desperately back to them, incredibly eager to finally collect the tiny breadcrumbs of affection I had starved for my entire life. I would have instantly forgiven every single horrific insult, every stolen opportunity, and every cruel Thanksgiving dinner joke just to finally hear my father say he was genuinely proud of me. But standing there at 34 years old, looking out over the incredible corporate empire I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears, I realized a profound, life-altering truth. I didn't need his apology anymore. It held absolutely no emotional power over me. His belated, desperate realization of my worth did not retroactively heal the terrified, lonely teenager crying in a freezing garage. I had already healed that teenager myself. I had done the excruciatingly hard, incredibly painful work of reparenting my own soul, of building my own unshakable confidence, and of creating a spectacular, massive life entirely on my own terms. Forgiving him would only serve to ease his overwhelming guilt, and frankly, I felt he absolutely needed to sit with that heavy guilt for the rest of his natural life. It was a metaphorical funeral for the men they used to be, and the absolute ultimate consequence of his actions. I didn't type a response. I didn't send a thumbs up emoji. I didn't write a scathing paragraph throwing his apology back in his face. I simply swiped left on the screen, hit the red delete button, and permanently erased the message from my phone. I slipped the device back into my pocket, picked up my expensive glass of bourbon, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. I looked out over the glittering, vibrant city that I had completely conquered. I was Julian Hayes. I was a survivor, a builder, and a titan. Blood might bring us into this world, but absolute respect, ironclad boundaries, and shared moral values are the only things that determine who gets the incredible privilege of walking alongside us in this life. And I was walking perfectly fine on my own.